Good morning, friends. Welcome to Sutta Study with Bhante Suddhaso. This morning we will be studying the Piyajatika Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 87, and you can find the link on the live chat. And welcome to Edward and any other friend that hasn't checked in yet, but that is watching. And of course, good morning to Bhante Suddhaso. So I'll pass it on to him and
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. Good morning, friends. So as mentioned, we'll be going through the Piyajatika Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya number 87, which is translated here as born from affection. So as usual, I'll read through the sutta and periodically give some explanations. And then at the end, we can have a bit of discussion about the sutta. So feel free to enter questions at any time during the broadcast, and I'll answer them at the end. So the sutta begins. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was dwelling at Savatthi in Jeta's grove at Anathapindika's park. On this occasion, there was a certain householder whose only son, who was loved by him and pleasing to him, had died. Because of that death, he did not work or eat. He would go to the cemetery and cry, "My only son, where are you? My only son, where are you?" Then that householder approached the Blessed One, paid respects to him, and sat to one side. When the householder was seated to one side, the Blessed One said to him, "Householder, you do not appear to have a stable mind. You appear to be deranged." And the householder says, "Bhante, how could I not be deranged? Bhante, my only son, who I loved and was pleased by, has died. Because of that death, I do not work or eat. I go to the cemetery and cry, 'My only son, where are you? My only son, where are you?'" And the Buddha replies, "That's how it is, householder. That's how it is. Householder, sorrow, grief, pain, dejection, and anguish are born from affection. They come from affection." And the man replies, "Bhante, how can you think that sorrow, grief, pain, dejection, and anguish are born from affection and come from affection? Bhante, delight and elation are born from affection. They come from affection." That householder did not delight in the Blessed One's speech. He condemned it, rose from his seat, and left. So the householder clearly didn't get the Buddha's point here. So again, this is the case of someone who their son has died. So their child, who they loved very much, has died. And of course, it's normal for someone to experience a sense of loss, a sense of grief. That's normal. It's not surprising. So when we have very strong attachment or affection for someone, then when that person disappears from our life, or when they die, or when they change in some dramatic or unpleasant way, then a sense of sorrow, grief, dejection, despair, anguish, these are all things which we can expect to arise. So that's the Buddha's point. The Buddha is pointing to the fact that when we have attachment to a person or to anything at all, actually, but in this case it's referring to people. When we have attachment to people, then that creates the conditions for us to experience sorrow, pain, dejection, anguish, grief, and despair. So it's creating the circumstances for that to arise. And this is coming because when we are attached to something, we are falling into the delusion of reliability, the delusion of dependability, the delusion of permanence. When in actuality, everything is impermanent, everything is unstable, everything is uncertain, everything is constantly changing. So we're creating a fantasy world in our mind and trying to live in that fantasy world. But eventually, our internal fantasy world becomes so different from external reality that we experience dissonance. We experience a disconnect, which then leads to extreme mental anguish. So, being attached to one's child, one thinks this child will be with me forever. This child will be the way I want them to be forever. And then when that's not the way things work out, one gets very distraught. So the proper attitude is right from the start to recognize all beings are of the nature to die. All beings are of the nature to change. All beings are of the nature to cease, to come and go. So then when beings cease and change and come and go, then it doesn't surprise us. And it's not puncturing our delusion because we don't have any delusion around this. We've already known that this was the way things are bound to be. But again, in this case, the householder, he was very attached to his child, and he apparently was not reflecting on the fact that all beings are subject to death, all beings are subject to change, to cease. And the householder also wasn't recognizing that his attachment was creating the conditions for him to experience grief and sorrow. But then when the Buddha delivers this lesson, when the Buddha points out to him that his dejection and sorrow and anguish was arising from his affection, his attachment, his delusion, fundamentally, the householder just got upset, rejected the Buddha's statement. It wasn't what he wanted to hear. And I find this very noteworthy because these days people will commonly say, like, oh, if somebody experiences a death in the family, that you should just comfort them and be there for them. It's not the right time to talk about impermanence. It's not the right time to talk about dukkha. But the Buddha apparently thinks it's exactly the right time. It's like, oh, you had a death in the family? Well, that's to be expected. But all of the mental dukkha that you're experiencing is your own fault. It's your own decision. You created the conditions for all of this mental dukkha. So now that it's arisen, well, it's not surprising, is it? We put it there. But the householder was not ready to hear this. So again, the householder rejected the Buddha's statement and left. And the sutta continues. On this occasion, several gamblers were playing with dice, not far from the Blessed One. Then the householder approached those gamblers and said to them, Sirs, here I approached the contemplative Gautama, paid respects to him, and sat to one side. When I was seated to one side, the Blessed One said to me, Householder, you do not appear to have a stable mind, you appear to be deranged. Sirs, when this was said, I said to the contemplative Gautama, Bhante, how could I not be deranged? Bhante, my only son, who I loved and was pleased by, has died. Because of that death, I do not work or eat. I go to the cemetery and cry, My only son, where are you? My only son, where are you? And the Buddha replied, That's how it is, householder, that's how it is. Householder, sorrow, grief, pain, dejection, and anguish are born from affection. They come from affection. And the householder said to him, Bhante, how can you think that sorrow, grief, pain, dejection, and anguish are born from affection and come from affection? Bhante, delight and elation are born from affection. They come from affection. Then, sirs, I did not delight in the contemplative Gautama's speech. I condemned it, rose from my seat, and left. And the gamblers reply, That's how it is, householder, that's how it is. Householder, delight and elation are born from affection. They come from affection. Then that householder left, thinking, the gamblers agree with me. So this also indicates how incredibly foolish this householder is. So he goes to the Buddha, and the Buddha gives him a Dhamma teaching. And instead of accepting the instruction, the householder rejected it and then found some gamblers who would agree with him. I'm just going to let that settle in. He didn't like what the Buddha said, so he went and he found some gamblers to reaffirm his pre-existing opinions. So clearly this householder was a little bit lacking in wisdom, in that he would take the advice of some gamblers over the advice of a Buddha. But again here, the statement, delight and elation are born from affection. That's a very short-sighted perspective. Very short-sighted because it's only true for a period of time. So in this case, the householder had his son and he loved his son very much. He had this very strong attachment to his son, very strong affection for his son. And I'm sure that did bring him some delight while the son was alive, brought him some delight while the son was behaving in the way the householder liked. But then things changed. The son died. And then that same affection, which was bringing him delight shortly before, now is bringing him sorrow and grief. Because it's, again, it's based upon attachment to that which is unreliable, dependence upon that which is undependable. So of course that creates the conditions for disturbance and failure. So it's important though, again, not to then think that we shouldn't care about our relatives and friends. Of course we should care. We should care deeply. We should have compassion for them, as we were speaking about yesterday with the talk on the Brahmaviharas. We should care deeply about our relatives and friends and do what we can to help them and support them, to help them overcome their suffering and attain true happiness. Of course, we should do that. But we also need to recognize that relationships are impermanent, unstable, unreliable, and unsatisfying. And that they're subject to end at any time without notice. So that then when that happens, then we're not disturbed and bothered. We can just let it wash over us. So the sutta continues. An account of this conversation eventually entered the royal palace. So the word got around about what had happened. Then King Pasenadi of Kosala said to Queen Malika, Malika, this was said by the contemplative Gautama. Sorrow, grief, pain, dejection, and anguish are born from affection. They come from affection. And Queen Malika replies, Great King, if that is what the Blessed One said, then that's how it is. So at this point in time, Queen Malika was already a Buddhist, but King Pasenadi was not yet a Buddhist. King Pasenadi was still doubtful about the Buddha's teachings. So we have this case where King Pasenadi is like, oh, I heard this absurd thing the Buddha said. And Queen Malika just says, well, if that's what the Buddha said, then it's true. And the king says, no matter what the contemplative Gautama says, Malika approves of it in this way. Great King, if that is what the Blessed One said, that's how it is. It is just like when a teacher says something to a student, the student always approves of it by saying, that's how it is, teacher. That's how it is, teacher. In the same way, Malika, no matter what the contemplative Gautama says, you approve of it in this way. Great King, if that is what the Blessed One said, then that's how it is. Bah! Malika, get lost. That's a literal translation, by the way. He actually did say get lost in Pali. I assume apparently finds this amusing.
What is the Pali for get lost?
I'm looking for it right now because Vinasa. Vinasati means to lose. So Vinasa means like you get lost. You're making a note of that? You want to know how to say get lost in Pali? I've been trying to teach her Pali for years, and this is the only thing she actually wants to know is how to say get lost. Anyway, so this also indicates here that King Pasenadi didn't actually reflect deeply on the Buddha's teachings. Again, when Malika approved of, apparently he brought it up expecting that Queen Malika would agree that it was a silly statement. So then when Malika agreed with it, that seems to have fueled King Pasenadi's irritation. Anyway, so then Queen Malika addressed the Brahmin Nali Janga. Brahmin, go to the Blessed One, and with your head at his feet, revere him with my words. Bhante, Queen Malika reveres you with her head at your feet and asks if you are unafflicted, healthy, unburdened, strong, and comfortable. Then say, Bhante, did the Blessed One make the statement, sorrow, grief, pain, dejection, and anguish are born from affection? They come from affection. As the Blessed One explains, carefully learn what he says and report it to me. Tathagatas do not speak what is not true. This is a very important statement, by the way. When we go over the Loka Sutta, we'll talk about this in more detail. I think that's next week, maybe?
Maybe.
Anyway, pretty soon we'll go over the Loka Sutta, which describes the definition of the word Tathagata. So one of the meanings of the word Tathagata is one who speaks the truth speaker. So Tathagata, by definition, only says true statements. They never lie. So Queen Malika sends the Brahmin Nali Janga to go and check with the Buddha whether he actually said this and what he meant by it. So yes, madam, the Brahmin Nali Janga replied to Queen Malika. He approached the Blessed One and conversed with him. After engaging in the appropriate polite conversation, the Brahmin Nali Janga sat to one side and said to the Blessed One, Sir Gautama, Queen Malika reveres Sir Gautama with her head at your feet. She asks if you are unafflicted, healthy, unburdened, strong, and comfortable. She also says, Bhante, did the Blessed One make the statement, sorrow, grief, pain, dejection, and anguish are born from affection, they come from affection? Minor side point, the fact that the Brahmin just engaged in polite conversation with the Buddha and then sat to one side without bowing to the Buddha, and also the fact that he addresses the Buddha as Sir Gautama rather than as Bhante or Blessed One. All of this indicates that the Brahmin Nali Janga also was not a Buddhist at the time. Anyway, the Buddha replies, that's how it is, Brahmin, that's how it is. Brahmin, sorrow, grief, pain, dejection, and anguish are born from affection. They come from affection. Brahmin, there is a way that one can understand that sorrow, grief, pain, dejection, and anguish are born from affection and come from affection. Brahmin, in the past there was a woman here in Savatthi whose mother died. Because of that death, she was distraught and mentally disturbed. She would go from street to street, from intersection to intersection, saying, have you seen my mother? Have you seen my mother? Brahmin, this is a way that one can understand that sorrow, grief, pain, dejection, and anguish are born from affection and come from affection. Brahmin, in the past there was a woman here in Savatthi whose father died, and he goes through the same thing with brother, sister, son, daughter, and husband dying. Again, the person becomes distraught and mentally disturbed and goes through the city asking people, have you seen my dead relative? And then he says the case of a man whose mother, father, brother, sister, son, daughter, and wife died, and similarly went through the town saying, have you seen my relative? Have you seen my relative? So again, indicating how a death in the family, the death of someone who we're deeply attached to, then creates this mental derangement, this extreme mental disturbance, which is arising because of once again, because of our attachment, our failure to recognize that the people that we are attached to are impermanent, subject to death, just as everybody else is. So when we have somebody in our life who we really like and appreciate, then we tend to have this subconscious assumption that they're going to be with us forever, or at least for a while longer. So when that suddenly changes, then we experience this deep pain as our delusion is suddenly thrown in our face. And the Buddha gives another story. He says, Brahman, in the past there was a woman here in Savatthi who went to visit her relatives. Her relatives separated her from her husband and wanted to give her to a different man. That's not very nice of them. She did not want that. Then that woman said to her husband, Noble sir, my relatives have separated me from you and want to give me to a different man. I do not want that. Then that man cut the woman in two and sliced himself open, saying, we will be together after death. So murder-suicide pact, as we call it these days. You seem a little surprised by this.
Samsara.
Yeah. Brahman, this is a way that one can understand that sorrow, grief, pain, dejection, and anguish are born from affection and come from affection. So again, this is a case where you have two people who are so attached to each other that they would rather do a murder-suicide pact than move on with their lives in a way that makes them separated. So on the one hand, that's very cute and romantic. But on the other hand, you can see how all of this pain and dukkha, all this sorrow, grief, and despair comes from affection. So affection here, by the way, is not metta, but rather it is a deep attachment founded in liking, founded in preference. So there can be an element of metta involved in there, but it's tainted by attachment and obsession. Then the Brahmin Nalijanga delighted in and approved of the Blessed One's speech. He rose from his seat, went to Queen Malika, and reported to her his entire conversation with the Blessed One. Then Queen Malika went to King Kusainadi and said to him, what do you think, great king? Do you feel affection for Princess Vajiri? So that was one of the king's daughters, the Princess Vajiri. And he replied, yes, Malika, I feel affection for Princess Vajiri. He's like, of course I love my daughter. Why would I not? And she says, what do you think, great king? If there was a catastrophic change in Princess Vajiri, would you experience sorrow, grief, pain, dejection, and anguish? So in other words, if your daughter got terribly sick or mentally ill, or if she died, or something terrible happened to her, how would you feel? And the king replies, Malika, if there was a catastrophic change in Princess Vajiri, it would seriously alter my life. How could I not experience sorrow, grief, pain, dejection, and anguish? And Queen Malika says, great king, when the Blessed One, the one who knows and sees, the worthy one, the fully enlightened one, said, sorrow, grief, pain, dejection, and anguish are born from affection and come from affection, this is what he was referring to. Then she goes through the same thing with Lady Vasabha, who was apparently someone the king cared about. General Vidudaba, which I think was one of his sons. Yeah, it's one of his sons. And then finally she says, what do you think, great king? Do you feel affection for me? And he replies, yes, Malika, I feel affection for you. And same thing, if there was a catastrophic change in me, wouldn't you experience sorrow, grief, pain, dejection, and anguish? And he says, yes. And then finally, she says, what do you think, great king? Do you feel affection for the Kasi district of Kosala? And he replies, yes, Malika, I feel affection for the Kasi district of Kosala. Malika, it is because of power over the Kasi district of Kosala that we use sandalwood from Kasi and rare jewelry, fragrances, and cosmetics. So Kasi was an area that was famous for making really high quality incense and jewelry and cosmetics and so on. So it's mentioned a number of places in the sutta. So Kasi incense was considered to be the best incense in northern India at the time. And similarly, she says, what do you think, great king? If there was a catastrophic change in the Kasi district of Kosala, would you experience sorrow, grief, pain, dejection, and anguish? So here she's pointing out, it's not just attachment to people that the Buddha is talking about. He's also talking about attachment to places, attachment to wealth, attachment to sources of pleasure, attachment to luxuries. All of those things as well produce sorrow, grief, pain, dejection, and anguish. Because once again, it's attachment to something which is undependable, attachment to something which is not a reliable basis for happiness. And the king affirms what she says, and he says, wonderful Malika, marvelous Malika, the Blessed One sees so much with penetrative wisdom. Come, Malika, bathe me. So this seems random and out of place, but this is because at that time in northern India, before doing any religious activity, the custom was to bathe. The idea was that by purifying your body, then that would put you in the proper mind state to engage in a religious activity. So in many temples in various cultures to this day, there'll be a small basin of water outside the temple, and you'll ritually bathe. Sometimes it's just like rinsing your hands. Sometimes it's not even that much. Sometimes people will just dip their fingertips in the water. But it's still, it's that symbolic act of purifying your body, which reminds you to purify your mind. So this is a very common element in many religious cultures. So apparently this was something which was done in ancient India at the time. It's not a Buddhist custom per se, and in fact, the Buddha mocks the practice of ritual bathing in several suttas. But this is just to give you some sense as to why King Pasenadi is taking a bath at this point in the sutta. Then King Pasenadi of Kosala rose from his seat, arranged his upper robe on one shoulder, extended his hands with palms together towards the Blessed One, and proclaimed 3 times, homage to the Blessed One, the Worthy One, the Fully Enlightened One. Homage to the Blessed One, the Worthy One, the Fully Enlightened One. Homage to the Blessed One, the Worthy One, the Fully Enlightened One. That's Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Sama Sambuddhassa. So apparently King Pasenadi finally got the Buddha's point and was actually filled with a deep sense of reverence for the Buddha on account of this teaching. So it's the end of the sutta. Relatively straightforward sutta. If you have any questions or comments, please go ahead and type them in, and we'll have some discussion.
Thank you, Bhante. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And Gita says, Bhante, they still do that in India, the bathing. Also, common practice is to be vegetarian if you're going to temple for Hinduism. And I was thinking, actually, excuse me, that in Catholicism as well, whenever you enter church, there's the holy water, and you do the sign of the cross. Before,
like you dip your fingers in the holy water and then you make the sign of the cross.
Yeah. Very interesting.
Yeah, the concept of the purification through bathing or purification through holy water is present in countless religions. It's a really common thing.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And in the meanwhile, we've had a few friends check in, so I'll say hello to all of you. Good to see you, Bradley, Elaine, Michael, Ishan, Mark, who says glad to be here. We're also glad you're here. And Sarah, good to see you, as well as Gita, of course, and Ada, and John. All right, so Bradley had said, how do you say get lost in Pali? I'd love to know.
See, that's what people want to know. It's kind of like when somebody starts learning a new language, the first thing they want to know is swear words.
Vinasati.
Vinasa.
Vinasa.
Vinasa is the imperative form.
Yeah.
So Vinassa. Vinasa.
But you get lost.
Vinasa is like when you're telling another person to get lost. So it's the second person imperative.
So vinasati.
Vinasa,
Without the T?
without the T.
Okay.
Just vinasa. That's it.
Let me remove the T. And Mike says, doesn't seem to me that suffering is born from affection any more than bad fruit is born from a healthy tree. Seems more that suffering is born from attachment. Seems that affection is necessary, part of enlightened ones in my experience.
So I think that's getting into a semantic thing. So this is why I tried to make a distinction between metta. So metta is benevolence or goodwill or unconditional love, perfect love. But affection in the sutta, the Pali word is piya, which seems to carry an implication of attachment. So an implication of liking mixed with attachment. This is not metta. It's not that pure-hearted benevolence. So that's the distinction that's being made here. The English word affection, perhaps it's not strong enough to capture this, though in my mind the word affection does carry an implication of liking and attachment, so I think it's actually a reasonable translation of this term. But yeah, what I would say is that metta is a standard characteristic of an enlightened being's mind, but affection in the sense of a preferential attachment to a person would not be present in their mind. Okay? Anything else?
Yes. Sarah is asking, can you have affection and acceptance? These people don't seem to accept death at all. Do you create poor karma through affection for another than just accept the pain when the inevitable arises?
So I think that, again, we need to make a distinction here between the wise love of metta, so genuinely caring about another person, genuinely wanting them to be happy, wanting them to be free of suffering, working to make their lives better and more joyful. That's all perfectly good and wholesome, as long as there's also the recognition that that person is outside of our control. They might change at any time. They might die at any time. They might leave our lives at any time. And we need to be willing to accept that right from the very beginning. So right from the very beginning, we should reflect. This person is of the nature to decay, get sick, die, be lost to me. This is the way it is. And that person is creating their own karma and experiencing the consequences of their own karma. So we need to have this recognition right from the start that as much as we care about a person, ultimately they are outside of our control, which means that we are ready to face the loss of that person at any time. In fact, one recollection which is really helpful. So somebody once asked Ajahn Chah, what is right view? And Ajahn Chah picked up a cup and he said, right view is knowing that this cup is already broken. So the point he's making there is that if you accept the fragile nature of the cup, if you accept that the cup is inevitably going to get broken, then when it does happen, then you'll just be like, oh, well, it's just expressing its nature of being breakable. Well, it's the saying. All of your friends and relatives, you should be reminding yourself, this person is already dead. So then when it happens, you're like, well, yeah, saw that one coming. No surprise there. It's the way of things. But while you have them in your life, then you still care about them deeply because you know that it matters. You know that it makes a difference. Okay?
Right. And Elaine is sharing, when my mom died in 2012, I was a basket case, very complicated relationship.
Mm.
Point is that the more people consoled me, the deeper I sank into a depression.
Well, that's another thing, is that often the consolation that people offer is just based on their own delusions. So consolation, and you have to know what you're doing, or else often you just wind up making things worse. So most people, they don't have a good understanding of human psychology. They don't have a good understanding of how minds and hearts work. And they don't have a good understanding of what you can say to someone that will help them see through their self-inflicted torment. So it's not surprising that what people said to you were just making the situation worse. That's really common. So I'm sorry that happened, but it's pretty common.
Oh, she's saying actually afterwards, the Buddha's words may sound harsh, but they were the only thing that turned me around. Gratitude to the Buddha and you venerables for these timely words. Dealing with a dying dog and fading father, and these words are precisely what I need.
Yeah, and that's exactly the way it is. So a lot of people, when they come across suttas like this, they think, oh, this sounds so harsh. This sounds so cruel. Why did the Buddha say these things? Rather than being like, oh, you poor man, you lost your son, how sad. Instead, the Buddha was like, hey, yeah, this is what happens. You get attached to people. And then when they die, you suffer because of your attachments. The Buddha's like, yeah, of course this is how it is. How could it be otherwise? So, like in my mind, the Buddha is saying this. He's saying it with infinite tenderness and gentleness. He's just like, yes, householder, that's true. Attachment brings suffering. That's true. You've seen it for yourself. So I imagine the Buddha saying this with so much gentleness and kindness. Because the Buddha sees this man suffering and he wants him to be free of suffering. He sees this man's pain and he realizes that it's self-inflicted. So he looks at that man and he says, dear sir, please stop hurting yourself. It's not necessary. You don't need to be inflicting this emotional pain on yourself. But in this sutta, the man was not ready to hear that. He wasn't willing to accept the teaching that was being given. But yeah, so the Buddha, he's not just offering empty platitudes or meaningless words of solace. The Buddha is offering a way of reshaping our mind, of training our mind, so that it becomes immune to the pain of the world. That's much more valuable than empty words of comfort.
Yeah, and Bradley seems to echo that sentiment, saying, I actually find the Buddha saying this to be the best kind of consolation. People, in an attempt to console, often deny the gravity of the situation or deny the person's feelings. But I find that the Buddha acknowledges the real pain that's there. That's how it is, householder.
Yeah.
And then offers a useful way to heal. And Ishan earlier, but he also added that you might have already answered his question. He says, Dear Bhante, sometimes it is difficult to explain this to parents when someone close passed away. They feel otherwise, and that sometimes affects me as well. How should I deal with that?
Well, then feel compassion for your parents. Recognize that on account of their own misunderstanding, that they're experiencing a lot of torment. So if they're not open to hearing these kinds of teachings, then just do kind things for them. Be there for them, help them out, bring them little gifts, help out with the chores, do things that help them out in ordinary ways, things that bring them some ordinary comfort. And then when they start to emerge from their derangement, then you might be able to give them a teaching like this and they might receive it. That said, for people who are not Buddhist, teachings like this often don't go over particularly well. So this is one of the challenging things. The Buddha offers incredible advice about how to be happy and content and peaceful with all the changing conditions of life. But people who are not Buddhist often cannot accept this. They don't want to accept it. And often people have this idea of like, well, if I'm not dejected and deranged and despairing when my loved one dies, that must mean I didn't love them. So often people feel they're morally obligated to fall into extreme grief and despair at the death of a loved one. But that's not the case. That's just piling more suffering on top of suffering. We're not obligated to be miserable when a loved one dies. And not being miserable doesn't mean that we didn't love them. You can love somebody very deeply and then not be deeply disturbed when they pass away.
All right, I think that's all for this morning. I had a question. What is the Pali word that you translated for affection?
Piya.
Piya?
Yeah, P-I-Y-A.
P-I-Y-A.
Yeah.
Interesting. And Ela says, the world would be so much more beautiful if more people thought this way, loving kindness without attachment. Yes. Yeah. And I think on that note, we can end the morning session. Thank you, Bhante, for sharing the teachings of the Buddha. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you this evening for monk chat. So you can bring all the questions you have on Dhamma or related to Dhamma to this evening's session. And Bhante and I will do our best to answer them. And then we'll meet again next week from Wednesday to Friday as usual. So 8 a.m. and 7:30 p.m. New York City time. For, as usual, Sutta study in the morning and Dhamma talk in the evening. All right. Well, have a great rest of the day and we'll see you soon. Have a great